As happy as I am to be here today, I've dreaded this moment. I've dreaded trying to figure out how to introduce these two intellectual giants, two magnificent public intellectuals whose enormous intelligence spills beyond the bounds of their disciplines and beyond the confines of academia. One wants to be as clever and learned in introducing them as they will be in their lectures. Well, I've given up. I will just tell you that I admire in each not only the fluidity and fluency of their thinking, the unwaveringly important issues they undertake, but also the lives each have chosen to live. Lives infused with the ideals they so carefully and also playfully examine. Lives where they take their passion and concern for justice outside academia's towers and bring back not tales of mere shadows, but gems that illuminate our thinking. It is this dialectic between intellectual existence and actual engagement that draws me so to both Michael Bérubé and Martha Nussbaum. Michael Bérubé is currently the Paterno Family Professor in Literature at Pennsylvania State University. These days he writes prolifically on liberal arts, education, and disability in both scholarly and in popular media, such as Harper's, The New Yorker, Dissent, New York Times Magazine section, The Washington Post, you get the idea. His book, Life as We Know It, A Father, a Family, and an Exceptional Child, is to me a model of how to write passionately, unsentimentally, profoundly about a life with a child with cognitive disabilities. There are some thoughts you carry around in your head all the time. One such for me is the moment in Michael's book when he must have looked lost, and Janet Lyons, a scholar in her own right, his partner and Jamie's mother, says to him, "We can handle this. This is not a stopper. We can handle this together." That, and writing about Wittgenstein and life with Jamie seamlessly in one chapter. Jamie, who I recently had the pleasure of spending time with, has grown to be a marvelous young man, as fascinated with the world as his father is with him. Michael has just recently stopped a very successful blog of his own, and thus he could find time to join us today. Michael will respond to Martha Nussbaum's paper. Martha Nussbaum is currently Ernst Freund Distinguished Service Professor of Law and Ethics at the University of Chicago, where she is professor in the Department of Philosophy, the Law School, the Divinity School, and is founder and coordinator of the University of Chicago's Center for Comparative Constitutionalism. She has so many honors and titles and books that if I begin to recite the prodigious list of accomplishments, we'll never hear her speak. She has enriched philosophy with her depth and breadth of interests, all focused on making this a more just, more joyful, and more livable world. I am personally so grateful to her for turning her attention to cognitive disability, and in that alone, helping to make it a legitimate concern for philosophers. And for making my daughter Sesha, whom she has yet to meet, an international celebrity. Her book, Frontiers of Justice, is immensely important in bringing together the marginalia of justice theory and putting these concerns front and center. Without further ado, I give you Martha Nussbaum.
It's enormously exciting and a great honor to be speaking at this important conference. Eva Kittay's work over the years has shown us all how first-rate philosophy can illuminate an area of urgent human importance. And I know that we're all grateful to her for the work she's done bringing together such a diverse and wonderful group of thinkers for this conference. So thank you so much, Eva. The presence of people with cognitive disabilities in our societies poses a twofold challenge to philosophical theories of justice. First, it poses a direct challenge. Here are some of our fellow citizens and fellow participants in human dignity. Their needs, real and important, have not been adequately addressed by previous theories of justice. So the direct challenge asks us to design theories that address these needs and offer good normative guidance for societies seeking to do justice to them. Second, it poses an indirect challenge by offering a test we can apply to all candidate theories of justice. We ask of each of the theories how the principles they suggest would treat the entitlements of people with cognitive disabilities, and we find fault with theories that, however attractive in other respects, cannot handle that issue well. By the same token, the ability of a theory to handle it well is at least one point in favor of such a theory. In Frontiers of Justice, I focus primarily on the second question, using the issue of disability as one test to apply to theories of justice that employ the idea of a social contract. I argued that such theories, even Rawls's, the most subtle and adequate of them all, cannot fully pass the test. That is, its treatment of this one area is not fully adequate. If we can find a theory that does as well in other areas and better in this one, we ought to prefer that theory. I then argued that my version of the capabilities approach does well, at least, in other areas and better in this one, though it was beyond my purpose to argue that it does as well as Rawls's in the other areas, and certainly I have not yet argued that it does better. That question was left for a further inquiry. The direct challenge was relevant to my argument because one could hardly show that the capabilities approach did better than Rawls's theory on the proposed test without saying quite a lot about what it recommends and how it argues for its recommendations. Large parts of the direct challenge, however, remained unaddressed. I focused on education of children and said relatively little about other areas of human capability and functioning. The present paper aims to fill that gap by showing in much greater detail how my capabilities approach argues in this area and what, or at least some of the specific policies are that it recommends for both children and adults. I continue, as in the book, to focus on cognitive disability, because that is the focus of the present conference, but I'm aware that there's a great deal that I will ultimately need to say about emotional disturbances and mental illnesses of many types, as well as the, in some ways, easier case of physical disability. A central job of the present paper will be to return to the difficult question of what equal respect for persons as citizens requires, and to what extent it requires equalizing the relevant capabilities. The capabilities approach, as I've articulated it, is a social minimum approach, and I've always said that for this reason it is but a partial theory of social justice. It doesn't say what should be done about inequalities above its rather ample threshold. Nonetheless, even in pursuit of a decent social minimum, we need to ask when a decent minimum of respect for persons requires full equality of the relevant capabilities, and when it requires only something like adequacy. I began to face that task in the chapters of Frontiers of Justice devoted to global justice, but I did not connect that analysis back to the earlier analysis of disability. I must also then fill that gap. Confronting the direct challenge will have some theoretically interesting results, for I shall argue that the area of the capabilities approach that is in general the most controversial and difficult in the American context, its strong emphasis on social and economic entitlements, is the easiest and simplest to apply to the case of cognitive disability. Nobody should be surprised by my conclusions in that area. Education is somewhat more complicated and more controversial, since equal respect recommends policies that are very expensive. Here, however, law has gotten in ahead of us, and the analysis I recommend is already not just statutory law under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, but it is also supported by constitutional law, which use the idea of equal protection to compel a remedy like IDEA, and which has very recently interpreted IDEA in an expansive and generous light. The surprising results will come in the area that usually looks so simple that we can basically take it for granted, the area of political and civil liberties. For I shall argue that showing equal respect for the dignity of citizens with cognitive disabilities requires giving them an equal right to vote, to serve on juries, and so forth, just as it entails that equal entitlement for everybody else. And I shall make a surprising and controversial use of notions of guardianship in that connection. I must, for reasons of time now, omit a discussion of the general approach of frontiers of justice. I hope the pertinent details will be clear from the following sections. Sometimes people understand the capabilities approach to recommend something like equalizing all the capabilities for everyone. No supporter of a capability-centered approach has ever said anything like this, to my knowledge. Sen does say that insofar as equality is our goal, the most pertinent space within which to think about and measure equality is that of capabilities. But he never says that our goal ought to be equality in all of them. Indeed, as Ronald Dworkin argues, such a social goal would be truly bizarre and would have some absurd entailments. My own approach is different from Sen's in that it uses a specific list of the central human capabilities as its benchmark for the definition of a social minimum. Even here, however, the approach recommends, as a necessary condition of social justice, not complete equalizing of all the capabilities. That, however, bringing all citizens above a rather ample threshold on each of the 10 capabilities, not complete equalizing of all the capabilities. That, however, is not the end of the matter, as it turns out. The idea of equality crops up again in thinking about the threshold for at least some of the capabilities. I broached this question in Frontiers of Justice, Chapter 5, but the present paper will press much further, so I must begin by recapitulating the position I took there. The capabilities approach uses the idea of a threshold. For each important entitlement, there's some appropriate level beneath which it seems right to say that the relevant entitlement has not been secured. The intuitive idea of a life worthy of human dignity already suggests this. People are entitled not only to mere life, but to a life compatible with human dignity. And this means that the relevant goods must be available at a sufficiently high level. So far, the approach insists only on the idea of adequacy or sufficiency, and has stated that the question of what to do with inequalities above the minimum threshold is a further question that the approach has not yet answered. It is in that way as yet incomplete. It seems crucial, however, to say more if we can, for we must indicate where and to what extent equality is part of the very idea of sufficiency. The list itself suggests that there are some instances in which we will not tolerate inequality of the relevant capabilities. Capability 7b, for example, speaks of, quote, having the social bases of self-respect and non-humiliation, being able to be treated as a dignified being whose worth is equal to that of others, end quote. And it connects this idea to the idea of non-discrimination. It seems crucial to go further at this point, spelling out the role of an idea of equal entitlement in the approach. Notice that in this area, I also make my one concession to paternalism, for I say that people should not be permitted to be humiliated by government, even if they want to be. In that case, we should not shoot simply for the capability to be treated as a dignified being, but we should shoot for actual functioning. The touchstone should always be, I believe, the idea of human dignity and the closely related idea of the social bases of self-respect and non-humiliation. Equality of capability is an essential social goal wherever the absence of equality would be connected with a deficit in dignity and self-respect. We've seen that the idea of dignity is spelled out from the beginning in terms of equality. It is the equal dignity of human beings that demands recognition, and here the idea of equality is essential. We must add it to the bare idea of dignity in order to articulate the goal in an adequate way. This idea that equal dignity is what we must protect and promote has implications for many of the capabilities on the list. For it appears, and a long tradition of Western political philosophy agrees on this point, that all of the political, religious, and civil liberties can only be adequately secured if they are equally secured. To give some groups of people unequal voting rights or unequal religious liberty is to set them up in a position of subordination and indignity vis-a-vis others. It is to fail to recognize their equal human dignity. Large stretches of the US tradition of constitutional law reflect such thinking. On the other side, there are other capabilities closely connected with the idea of property or instrumental goods, where what seems appropriate is enough. For example, an adequate house or other shelter seems to be inherent in the idea of human dignity, and it seems right that constitutions all over the world are beginning to recognize the right to housing as a constitutional entitlement, following the creative lead of South African jurisprudence. It's not at all clear, however, that an equal house is required by the very idea of human dignity, or even of equal human dignity. For indeed, a mansion may not be better for a human being than a modest house. House size above a certain threshold does not seem intrinsically related to equal human dignity. Insofar as envy and competition make people feel that an unequal house is a sign of unequal dignity, we might wonder whether these judgments are not based on an excessive valuation of material goods, which a just society might decide not to honor. The case is not clear. As Adam Smith observed, what is compatible with human dignity may itself vary from society to society. In England, the ability to appear in public without shame requires a shirt. In some other nations, it does not. We might add that the ability to sit in the front of the bus is connected to human dignity not timelessly, but through a set of social norms and practices. Thus, the fact that that house size is connected to dignity through social norms does not suffice to undermine the connection. It does, however, prompt a further inquiry. At least sometimes we may find that excessive valuation of competitive goods lies behind a social norm, and a just society could decide not to honor that valuation. This is surely one area where different nations, with their different traditions, will need to work out the problem for themselves through ample public deliberation. In some areas that seem to fall on the material side, however, it does seem clear that grossly unequal shares fail to meet the adequacy condition. If education, for example, is arranged as it currently is in the United States, in such a way that students in a rich school district may have as much as 75 or 100 times as much spent on them as is spent on students in a poor district, this does seem to be in and of itself a violation of equal dignity and equal political liberty. At least where primary and secondary education are concerned, adequacy does appear to require something close to equality, or at least a very high minimum, perhaps allowing for divergences in aspects of education that are not firmly linked to basic opportunity and political participation. The same is true of essential health care. Whether higher education and non-essential health care are matters in which we may accept unequal shares as compatible with the threshold of adequacy remains a question that societies will have to hammer out. Harry Frankfurt influentially argues that equality all on its own is not a distinct political value. It becomes important when it affects some other capacity, such as the capacity for speech, or self-respect, or a life with dignity, or for relationships not predicated on hierarchy. Apart from its connection to the content of these values, it remains a bare formal notion. How should the proponent of a capabilities approach respond to Frankfurt's challenge? The matter is very difficult to think about, and all statements ought to be tentative. We should begin by insisting again that equality is important at the very base of the theory, for it's not just human dignity that must be respected, it is equal human dignity. Equality here is not just a proxy for some other value, it's a constituent part of the basic value, human dignity, to be respected and promoted. This role for equality, however, does not entail that equality is a reasonable goal with regard to all the central capabilities. Some capabilities must be secured to citizens on a basis of equality, or equal dignity has not been respected. Others, however, do not seem to have this intrinsic relationship to dignity. With these, the capabilities approach supplies a threshold of adequacy. Some nations and individuals may prefer a more egalitarian solution with these capabilities as well, but it seems likely that if we want a political conception that can achieve something like an overlapping consensus among people who differ in their comprehensive ethical and religious doctrines, especially when we're considering transnational transfers of wealth, this conception is more likely to prove broadly acceptable than one that insists on equality in all the central capabilities. Individuals whose comprehensive doctrine is more exigent can at least recognize the political conception as compatible with their own doctrine, though it does not deliver everything that they themselves would favor. What this means is that we need to take the capabilities one by one and ask whether adequacy or equality is the relevant threshold in this area, and what, more concretely, this goal entails. And we must do this in a way that's sensitive to social norms, for we don't want to forget that social norms profoundly affect what is and isn't compatible with equal human dignity. And I'll skip the example of the rest of this paragraph. When we deal with the capabilities of people with cognitive disabilities, a preference-based approach is particularly likely to offer bad guidance, because we are well aware that many, if not most, social preferences in this area are deformed by ignorance, stigma, and fear. That likelihood should give us a preference for capabilities equality where we can't give any good reason against it. Here, we should take a lesson from US constitutional law. Under the Equal Protection Clause, whenever a classification is particularly likely to be infected by prejudice, there's a strong case for according that classification some type of heightened scrutiny. In other words, any differential treatment of that group must be justified by an unusually strong state interest, which is called compelling. Although people with cognitive disabilities have been said not to be a suspect class warranting heightened scrutiny, I've argued that heightened scrutiny is appropriate in their case. So here then, I apply something like that test. If people with cognitive disabilities have unequal capabilities in some area on my capabilities list, that can be justified only by a compelling state interest. So now, social and economic entitlements. The US is not consistently supportive of the capabilities of citizens on the side of what are standardly called social and economic rights. Other nations do much better. As I argued in the previous section, however, entitlements such as entitlements to housing, to health care, and others in that group require a high threshold of adequacy rather than complete equality for their fulfillment. Should people with cognitive disabilities have the same entitlements in these areas as so-called normal people? By and large, we already agree that the answer is yes. There are defects in healthcare schemes and in subsidized housing. Where there is subsidized housing, our nation in particular does far too little to support the labor of care involved in supporting the capabilities, health, mobility, bodily integrity of both people with disabilities and elderly people, as Eva Kate has so eloquently argued. But the argument that people with cognitive disabilities deserve the same level of care as people without cognitive disabilities, for example, physically infirm elderly people, is an easy one to make, and the argument that remains concerns the level of care that a decent society would provide. The debate about mental illness is actually a much more difficult debate in this area because people still tend to blame mental illness on the ill person and thus to be reluctant to grant them adequate medical support. Much the same goes for alcoholism and drug addiction. People with cognitive disabilities, like elderly people, aren't blamed for the care they need, so the debate about care in their case is not marred by false belief and inappropriate stigma. What needs to be done here is to convince all Americans to support a higher level of health care, nursing care, housing support, etc., for all. But the situation of people with cognitive disabilities does not appear to raise special problems. Next, equality in education. One might suppose that education for people with cognitive disabilities is also a threshold matter that raises issues about capability equality, but not about capability adequacy, but not capability equality. Sorry, Randy, I got that in the wrong order in the paper. In Frontiers of Justice, however, discussing equality and adequacy, I suggested that education was an area so central to matters of citizenship and self-respect that we should not tolerate a situation in which everyone comes up to some reasonable threshold, but gross inequalities remain. The US approach through constitutional law has never accepted this principle fully, but it has always been recognized that education is an area of fundamental importance in relation to citizenship. So, gross inequalities are unconstitutional if the disadvantaged do not come up to a rather ample threshold. Dissenting opinions have suggested that the protection of equality ought to be stronger, given the role played by education in relation to the freedom of speech. When educational disadvantages are not simply due to de facto economic segregation, but track an imposed segregation or exclusion of a group, however, the Constitution's Equal Protection Clause has been held to give the disadvantaged group an enforceable right to educational equality of a kind, meaning at least the removal of segregation and an equal openness of local school classrooms to members of the disadvantaged group. Thus, Brown versus Board of Education used the Equal Protection Clause to argue that legally mandated segregation was unconstitutional. The analysis in Brown was borrowed in the case that ultimately opened the public schools to children with a wide range of disabilities. In 1972, in Mills versus Board of Education, the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia ruled in favor of a group of children with cognitive disabilities who challenged their exclusions from the District of Columbia public schools. In an analysis that self-consciously set out to apply Brown v. Board of Education, the court held that the denial of free, suitable public education to the mentally disabled is an equal protection violation. Notice that the opinion understood Brown to be about the difference between exclusion and inclusion, not about a ban on special affirmative remedies. Indeed, it understands the Brown framework to suggest very strongly the need for such affirmative remedies. Children with disabilities, the court holds, will need to be given special support in order to be fully integrated into the public schools. Moreover, very important for our purposes, the court held that this equal protection violation could not be reasoned away by saying that the system had insufficient funds and these children were unusually expensive to include. Quote, "The inadequacies of the District of Columbia public school system, whether occasioned by insufficient funding or administrative inefficiency, certainly cannot be permitted to bear more heavily on the exceptional or handicapped child than on the normal child," end quote, the opinion argues. Significantly, at this point, the opinion quotes Goldberg versus Kelly to make the point that the state's interest in the welfare of its citizens, quote, "clearly outweighs its competing concern to prevent any increase in its fiscal and administrative burdens," end quote. The court quotes the resonant reflections of Justice Brennan and Goldberg to make this point, and I now quote that bit. "From its founding, the nation's basic commitment has been to foster the dignity and well-being of all persons within its borders. We have come to recognize that forces not within the control of the poor contribute to their poverty. Welfare, by meeting the basic demands of subsistence, can help bring within the reach of the poor the same opportunities that are available to others to participate meaningfully in the life of the community. Public assistance, then, is not mere charity, but a means to promote the general welfare and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity." Similarly, reasons the court, the District of Columbia's interest in the education of these excluded children, quote, "clearly must outweigh its interest in preserving its financial resources," end quote. Like Goldberg versus Kelly, the opinion emphasizes that the inclusion is not a matter of charity, but one of entitlement and basic justice. As a result of Mills, in 1975, Congress passed the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, which turned Mills into federal law, giving a wide range of children with cognitive disabilities enforceable rights to free, suitable public education, and making funds available to the states to help them meet their constitutional obligation. The law was slightly modified and elaborated in 1997 in the form of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. The guiding idea of the act, and I'm sure most of you are very familiar with this, is that children with disabilities are individuals, equal in dignity to so-called normal children, and that in consequence, education should be based on a careful, individualized consideration of a child's educational needs. The central vehicle of this idea is the IEP, the Individualized Education Program, quote, a written statement for each child with a disability that is developed, reviewed, and revised, end quote. The Act requires that states affirmatively undertake to identify and locate all children with disabilities whose needs have not been addressed. It also requires that districts establish extensive procedural safeguards to give parents input in decisions regarding the evaluation and placement of their children, as well as access to records and rights to participation in due process hearings and judicial review. In general, the Act obliges states to educate children with disabilities in the least restrictive environment appropriate to meet their needs. It thus urges mainstreaming of these children. But the underlying recognition of individuality is paramount. Thus, if a child will profit more from special education than from mainstreaming, the state is obliged to support a special placement, which sometimes will have to be in a tuition-charging private school. Thus, the remedy can often be very expensive for the state. My nephew Art, whose education I discussed in Frontiers of Justice, just graduated from high school. For about 8 years, the state he lives in had supported his placement in a special school for people with Asperger's syndrome, and the educational result has been superb. Art not only is college-bound, he also has a circle of friends whom he enjoys, and he is a happy kid. This is basically what I think the capabilities approach requires: affirmative measures to support the education of children with a range of cognitive disabilities so that they will have no education-related disadvantages as they prepare to enter society. So, not just adequacy, but equal concern and equal protection. Not every child with a cognitive disability will have educational attainments at Art's high level, but our IDEA, if implemented well, will ensure that something like equal concern has been shown by the very fact of considering the child's educational needs individually and designing a program to develop their human potential. IDEA has noble aspirations, and yet its implementation has been fraught with difficulty. For one thing, the funds were not appropriated for a long time, and even now the funding is not complete. Another major problem, however, is the IEP process, in which parents must negotiate with school committees who are not always well educated about the child's specific disability, and who often try to save money, even at the cost of not supporting a special placement for a child who clearly needs one. Autism spectrum disorders, the type of disability at issue in Winkleman, the Supreme Court case I'm about to talk about, often pose particular problems, making mainstreaming difficult. A whole range of human capabilities, from citizenship to intellectual and emotional development, are at stake in the IEP process, making adequate representation crucial. The Supreme Court considered this problem in 2007, interpreting the statute in a way that makes it clear that parents as well as children have rights under the Act. This interesting opinion further fleshes out what equal protection means in this context. Many poor parents can't afford to hire a lawyer. If they are denied the right to represent themselves, the already striking inequities of the Act, which clearly favors educated and articulate parents, become yet more striking. When discussions with the Parma, Ohio school district led to an impasse, the Winklemans, availing themselves of IDEA's administrative review procedures, filed a complaint, appealing to a state-level review officer. After losing that appeal, they appealed to the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Ohio. The district court found for the school district, so they appealed again to the Sixth Circuit. The Sixth Circuit held that IDEA does not grant parents independent rights, and that, in consequence, the Winklemans could not proceed unless they hired a lawyer. The Supreme Court reversed. In Winkleman versus Parma City School District, the court held that IDEA gives rights to parents as well as children in respect of their children's education, thus permitting parents of children with disabilities to represent themselves in court when challenging a child's IEP. The statute, carefully read, is not ambiguous, and thus their victory breaks no new legal ground. It does, however, illustrate an ongoing dialogue and partnership between legislative and judicial action that has resulted in the protection of human capabilities for many of our most vulnerable young citizens. Indeed, we might remark that our current court is significantly more friendly to children with cognitive disabilities than it is to children belonging to racial minorities. In the former case, the court not only did not cast doubt on the constitutionality of IDEA, it also read it in a wide and generous fashion. And this reading commanded a majority of 7. In the very same term, the same court struck down a wide range of affirmative action programs used to ensure full inclusion for children belonging to racial minorities. The rather shocking decision in Parents Involved versus Seattle School District can be criticized from many viewpoints. One interesting angle that's rarely mentioned, however, is the odd juxtaposition of this case with Winkleman, which suggests that some of the justices are far more sympathetic to the claims of children and parents with disabilities than they are to those of racial minorities. There would be a number of legal issues to be discussed at this point, but one issue that seems pertinent is that white middle-class people can and do have children with disabilities, while they do not have, biologically at least, unless they're interracially married, African-American children. I'm afraid that a certain moral obtuseness characterizes the majority in Parents Involved, and part of it might well be an inability to imagine the situation of those who are seen as not very like oneself. I've said that equal protection and equal respect do not require equality of educational outcomes. In that sense, the approach to education has a good deal in common with the approach in the area of mobility, and thus it might seem to be an adequacy approach, not an equality approach. However, the whole point of the approach is to ensure that no special disadvantages accrue to children with disabilities in virtue of their disability. They are equally placed in the education process and equally supported, which in their case requires a lot of affirmative measures and extra expense. After that, like all children, they will achieve at different rates and attain different levels. So the equality is in the concern and the strenuous requirements it imposes. But now, equality in political entitlements. Now to the difficult and controversial case. Where core political entitlements are concerned, we typically have no difficulty in concluding that adequacy of capability requires equality of capability. We do not hesitate a minute in thinking that the right to vote, the right to participate in the political process, and other basic civil rights, such as those of free speech and association, must be delivered to citizens on a basis of equality if the nation in question is to claim even minimal justice. Suppose women had half the votes that men did, or African Americans. We immediately see that these policies would be profoundly wrong. Even if someone were to claim that women and African Americans still have enough voting rights, we would say, surely not, for to have enough voting rights just means having equal voting rights. Similarly, the exclusion of women and African Americans from jury service, such a large feature of relatively recent political life, is now taken to be obviously and uncontroversially wrong. Why? It seems to express unequal respect for citizens, and politics must express equal respect as a very central and basic value. It's instructive to observe how deeply this insistence on equality of entitlement enters into law even in the United States, in many respects a profoundly inegalitarian society. Take the freedom of religion. Our constitutional tradition has understood the entitlement to religious liberty to be an entitlement to equal liberty. The words equal rights of conscience were used in many of the constitutional debates, and if they don't turn up in the final text, that is because they were by that time taken for granted. What that means is quite interesting. It means that minorities often receive special accommodations or special dispensations from laws of general applicability because only an accommodation would render their religious free exercise fully equal to that of the majority. Laws are always made by majorities. Majority preferences determine what work days will be chosen, what holidays will be observed, what intoxicants will be legal, etc. Well then, if minorities come up against such laws, even when the laws themselves express no hostile intent, they may face special burdens to their religious practice. They may be fired for refusing Saturday work. They may be told that they must serve in the military, even though their religion forbids that. They may be forbidden to use a hallucinogen in their sacred ceremony, even when the majority is allowed to use alcohol in its sacred ceremonies. The concept of accommodation is the idea that in such instances, the minority should not have to shoulder that unequal burden. They should be exempt from the law. In a 1789 letter to the Quakers who refused military service, George Washington wrote, quote, "I assure you very explicitly that in my opinion the conscientious scruples of all men should be treated with great delicacy and tenderness, and it is my wish and desire that the laws may always be as extensively accommodated to them as a due regard for the protection and essential interests of the nation may justify and permit," end quote. Washington did not require the Quakers to serve in the military, and he also did not require them to pay a fine or go to prison for breaking the law. In a famous 1963 case, Sherbert versus Verner, the US Supreme Court reasoned that accommodation was constitutionally required in the absence of a compelling state interest, and required for reasons of equality. To say that Mrs. Sherbert should not receive unemployment compensation because she refused jobs that required Saturday work was tantamount, they said, to fining someone for Saturday worship. In other words, minorities may not be required to face any substantial disadvantage in their religious lives that majorities do not also have to bear, absent a compelling state interest. Thus, the requirements of equal respect are extremely exigent. They brook no compromise, except in the gravest of cases. Let's now turn to the case of people with cognitive disabilities. In fact, there are 3 such cases. In case A, the person is capable of voting, serving on a jury, making religious choices, but because of stigma and majority social arrangements, really enabling the person to do that, putting the person in a position of what I call combined capability, will require special effort and expense. In case B, the person cannot exercise these functions on his or her own, even with special arrangements, but is able to communicate his or her preferences to a guardian, who can then exercise the function on his or her behalf. In case C, the person's disability is so profound that he or she is unable to perform the function in question, even to the extent of forming a view and communicating that view to a guardian. To simplify, I'll just assume that things are on a par with respect to the whole range of political capabilities I've identified, although that might not be the case in life. Some people might be able to make religious choices, but not able to vote, and so on. Case A is extremely easy. Equal respect for a person with a disability requires spending the money required to facilitate that person's full inclusion in the functions of citizenship, including voting, jury service, etc. This is just like the case of religion that I discussed above. A minority may not be given a diminished entitlement because of majority arrangements and majority preferences. Case A is, I said, easy, but its implications are still radical for the way voting and jury service are to be constructed and their requirements understood. Case B is also extremely easy. If the person can form a view about whom to vote for, but can't exercise that function in person by reason of a disability, then it seems obvious that a guardian ought to be entitled to exercise that function on the person's behalf. With voting, this may seldom be necessary, since online voting and absentee ballots facilitate the inclusion of such people. But let's think about jury service. Many people with a disability who currently do not serve on juries might be able to exercise this important civic function were a guardian entitled to represent them. How exactly the consultative arrangement would be worked out would be a matter for much debate, but that is a debate that should and must take place, whereas now it is not taking place. Let me now, however, turn to the most difficult case, case C. Here, the person's cognitive disability is so profound that he or she cannot communicate her wishes about whom to vote for to a guardian, or to exercise religious choices, or to serve on a jury, even in the sense of delegating a guardian to represent her judgments. What does equal respect require in this case? I would argue that it requires that the person's guardian be empowered to exercise the function on that person's behalf and in her interests. What's the alternative? That, as at present, a large group of citizens are simply disqualified from the most essential functions of citizenship. They do not count. Their interests are not weighed in the balance. That, to me, means that they are not regarded as fully equal citizens with a dignity commensurate with that of others. The bottom line is, I think, that one person, one vote is the right idea, and it is currently not being observed where people with profound cognitive disabilities are concerned. So let the guardian vote in that person's interest and serve on a jury when that person's name comes up. Let it be fully understood that the guardian is a representative of a person with a disability in such a way that where possible, and insofar as it is possible, the guardian is making choices expressive of that person's interests or preferences. This will seem very weird for a while, but it should not seem weird, and I think after a while it won't. Voting is quite straightforward. The accredited guardian shows up and casts a ballot in the interests of a person with a disability. Often it will be possible to figure out what those interests are. In the case of jury service, the representative function is not so easy to describe, since jurors are to put their own personal interests to the side. The guardian then will basically be a juror like any other, performing the juror's function as well as she can. But it will be known that she is there as the representative of a person with a disability, and that means that her presence serves to give due recognition to the person with a disability and to people with disabilities more generally. When jurors are questioned about their backgrounds, whose background should the guardian describe? Both people's, I would say. The guardian will have to disclose her own background because it is her own judgment she's using, and the possible biases in that judgment have to be disclosed. But since she's representing a person with a disability, she needs to describe that relationship as well, in case any biases would emerge from that description. For example, suppose the case involved sexual violence against a person with a disability. If the representing guardian spoke only about her own experience of sexual violence or lack of it, the lawyers for both sides would fail to be informed about a crucial factor that might bias the guardian's judgment. Religious and associational liberties are easier, and right now we basically do permit guardians to make key choices in these areas on the person's behalf and in that person's interest. Naturally, it will be said that there's room for corruption in this process. The guardian may just vote his or her own preferences and describe them to the person with a disability, thus doubling the guardian's own vote. It should be clear on reflection, however, that a decent guardian will be able to keep those interests apart. Sometimes a candidate's position will favor certain interests of the guardian that are not shared with the person with a disability, and the guardian should be able to see this. By contrast, the candidate may have certain disability-friendly policies that affect the interests of the person with a disability, but not those of the guardian. Again, a good guardian will see this. Many guardians won't be good, but what else is new? Every day, people vote because their parents are voting that way, or their spouse, or their pastor, or because their parents or spouse are voting the opposite way. We don't assess people for independence of mind when we give them the franchise, nor should we. So the claim that the guardian may do his or her job badly or incompletely is not a particular objection to my proposal. If we were to take it to heart, we might be led all the way to something like Mill's suggestion that educated people would have more votes than non-educated people. And we know we don't approve of that suggestion. Why don't we approve of it? Because it doesn't express equal respect for all citizens. So too here. I said earlier that any inequality in the political entitlements of people with disabilities should be examined under a very stringent standard of judicial review, and therefore could be justified only by something that would rise to the level of a compelling state interest. What might such an interest be? Administrative expense and complexity has traditionally not counted as such an interest, except in the most extreme cases. For example, the refusal of an Amish employer with many employees to pay Social Security tax for any of them, something that would not just harm the system, but would inflict a penalty on the employees. In this case, the difficulty of establishing who the certified guardian is would not appear to be very great. Preventing corruption in the voting process will surely be cited, but as I've already argued, that reason is not compelling. And if we should accept it, we will be led down the dangerous road of seeking only qualified or independent voters, something we have long rejected. In short, people with cognitive disabilities are equal citizens, and law ought to show respect for them as full equals. To do so, law must provide such people with equal entitlements to medical care, housing, and other economic needs. That's the easy part. But law must also go further, providing people with disabilities truly equal access to education, even when that is very costly and involves considerable change in current methods of instruction. Even that, our society has begun to realize. Now, we must take the most controversial step of all, giving such people political and civil rights on a basis of genuine equality. What that requires and why it requires something that seems at first so odd has been the theme broached, at least in this paper. Now let the debate begin.